She thought she was just saving a frail old woman on a rainy street, never imagining that moment would change her life forever. The girl was poor, innocent, and unnoticed, but the woman she helped was a secret millionaire searching for someone worthy. What happened next stunned an entire family and a son's guarded heart. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. Rain fell in sheets against the cracked pavement, splashing into deep puddles that mirrored the streetlights with trembling clarity. Emily Carter pulled her thin jacket tighter around her small frame, her shoes soaking through as she hurried along the street after another long day of work. She was 22 years old, already carrying the burdens of someone twice her age. Her younger brother, Jamie, was waiting at home with leftover soup, and she knew he would ask if she was. She always smiled and told him no, though her bones ached from balancing two part-time jobs, one at a diner during the day, another cleaning offices at night. It was routine, life carved by necessity, but Emily never complained. Her mother's words lived in her like a candle. Kindness costs nothing, but it can save everything. Since their parents had passed away, Emily had been both sister and mother to Jamie, determined to give him a chance at a life better than hers. As she hurried through the nearly empty street, headlights swished past, tires hissing on the wet asphalt. That was when she saw it. An older woman at the far corner suddenly faltered. One hand clutched her cane, the other pressed weakly against her chest. Her body trembled, knees giving way, and before anyone else could react, she collapsed into the rain. People passed by, umbrellas tilted, glances quick but dismissive. Some slowed, then continued on, as though compassion were a luxury they could not afford. Emily's heart clenched. Without hesitation, she splashed through the water, dropping her worn canvas bag to the ground as she knelt beside the stranger. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" she asked, voice trembling but gentle. The old woman groaned softly, eyes fluttering open with difficulty. Rain plastered her silver hair against her face. Emily pulled her own jacket from her shoulders, draping it across the woman's frail body. The fabric soaked almost immediately, but it was something. "Move, please. I'll call an ambulance." "No hospital," the woman whispered weakly, shaking her head. Her voice was fragile, yet laced with an authority Emily couldn't ignore. It collapsed. "You need to help me. Up, please." Emily bit her lip, torn. But something in the woman's eyes, sunburned, proud, unwilling to be seen as weak, made her relent. Carefully, Emily braced herself, slipping her arms beneath the woman's shoulders. She was heavier than expected, but Emily used all her strength, pulling her upright against the wall of a closed shop. "Thank you," the woman breathed, catching her breath. Her hand clutched Emily's wrist, surprisingly firm. "Are you sure you're all right?" Emily asked, brushing soaked strands of hair from the woman's face. A faint smile curved the older woman's lips. "I will be, thanks to you." Emily exhaled in relief, her heart still racing. She kept her hand steady against the woman's back, rubbing gently to soothe her. "I can wait here with you until you feel stronger. You shouldn't be alone in this weather." "Most would have walked on," the woman murmured, her gaze fixed on Emily's face as though studying her. "But you didn't." Emily shrugged, embarrassed. "Anyone would have helped." But the woman shook her head. "No, not anyone." Her voice carried a quiet conviction, as if she knew something Emily didn't. Emily glanced at the puddle-soaked street. "Do you live nearby? I can walk you home." "I'll manage," the woman said softly. "But tell me, what's your name, child?" "Emily." "Emily Carter." The woman repeated it, almost like committing it to memory. Then, with surprising steadiness, she straightened her posture. "You have a good heart, Emily Carter. Don't ever let the world convince you otherwise." Emily smiled faintly, shivering from the cold, but warmed by the words. She didn't think much of them. To her, it was just what anyone decent should do. But to the woman, whose sharp eyes had seen the cruelty of both wealth and poverty, it was something rare. As the woman disappeared into the rain, supported once more by her cane, Emily gathered her soaked jacket and bag, never realizing she had just changed the course of her own life. The following evening, Margaret Hale sat by the fire in her vast mansion, her cane resting against the arm of a velvet chair. The doctor had come and gone, scolding her for overexerting herself, but Margaret's mind wasn't on her health. It was on the young girl who had lifted her from the cold street with more care than most in her social circle ever showed. Emily Carter. Margaret whispered the name again, tasting the simplicity of it, the honesty. She had lived long enough to know when kindness was genuine and when it was performed for gain. Emily had nothing to gain that rainy night, and yet she had given everything she could. Warmth, strength, comfort. Margaret's family was powerful, her estate among the grandest in the city, yet she often felt suffocated by shallow alliances and people who measured worth in jewels and fortunes. Her son, Alexander, was much the same, hard-edged from years in business, suspicious of everyone's motives. Perhaps, Margaret thought, what her world needed was someone outside it, someone like Emily. But Margaret knew better than to act in haste. She summoned her assistant quietly the next morning. "Find out everything you can about Emily Carter," she instructed. "Where she lives, what she does, who her family is, and be discreet." The assistant hesitated. "Do you suspect her of something, madam?" Margaret's lips curved into a knowing smile. "No, I suspect she may be everything." At night, Emily returned home, soaked again from another shift at the diner. Jamie rushed to the door, grinning with his gap-toothed smile. "You're late. I kept the soup warm." Emily ruffled his hair affectionately, the exhaustion in her limbs fading when she saw him. "Thank you, chef. I'm starving." As they ate at the small wooden table, Emily said nothing about the woman she had helped. It hadn't seemed important. For her, kindness wasn't meant to be remembered, it was simply done. But miles away, in a mansion where secrets and fortunes slept behind locked doors, Margaret Hale thought of little else. The following days passed in their usual rhythm. For Emily, early, tenacity afternoons, and late nights balancing trays at the diner or sweeping floors in the dim silence of office buildings. She thought little of the rainy evening. To her, helping that frail woman had been no different than breathing. Compassion was a habit stitched into her being. But for Margaret Hale, the memory of Emily's kindness only grew sharper. She had seen countless faces over decades of wealth and status, polished smiles, shower courtesies, hearts cloaked in greed. Yet the face that lingered in her mind was not from a ballroom or a gala, but a young woman kneeling in the rain, giving her warmth without hesitation. Margaret's assistant returned 3 days later with a file. Margaret skimmed through it slowly, her old hands trembling. Emily Carter, 22, lived in a modest flat on the edge of town with her younger brother Jamie, aged 10. Parents deceased. Father, a factory worker, lost to illness. Mother passed 2 years after. Since then, Emily had carried the weight of both provider and nurturer. Multiple jobs, barely making ends meet, but no debts, no scandals. Pure resilience. Margaret felt her throat tighten. "She has nothing," she whispered, "and yet she gave me everything." The assistant raised a brow. "Shall I arrange a proper invitation to bring her here, madam?" Margaret's sharp eyes glinted. "Yes, but make it appear as gratitude. She mustn't suspect my intentions." Emily was surprised when a letter arrived, sealed in thick ivory paper with an elegant crest. She unfolded it carefully, frowning at the grateful handwriting. "Miss Carter, I owe you more than words can express. Please allow me the chance to thank you properly. Join me for tea at my home this Sunday afternoon. I insist. With gratitude, Margaret Hale." Emily reread the name. It meant nothing to her, though the formality and crest suggested wealth. She almost tucked it away, unwilling to miss work for something frivolous. But Jamie had snatched it from her hands, eyes wide. "You have to go." "It sounds fancy, Emmy. Maybe they'll pay you for helping." Emily laughed softly, shaking her head. "I didn't help her for money." "No," Jamie said seriously, his boyish face set with surprising gravity. "That's why you should go. Maybe she needs you again." Her brother's words stuck with her, and when Sunday came, Emily found herself nervously walking up the long driveway of the Hale estate. The mansion rose like something from another world. Columns of pale stone, windows glittering like mirrors, gardens manicured with perfection. Emily paused at the gates, clutching the strap of her worn handbag, feeling as though she didn't belong. But she squared her shoulders. She hadn't come for grandeur, she had come because a woman needed thanks to be given, and Emily respected that. Outside, she was greeted by a butler, who guided her into a sitting room. The space was vast, filled with gold-framed paintings and soft carpets that muffled her hesitant steps. Emily perched on the edge of a sofa, twisting her fingers together. Moments later, Margaret Hale entered. This time her posture was steady, her silver hair brushed into elegance, her presence commanding despite her frailty. "Dear Emily," Margaret said warmly, her cane tapping against the floor as she approached. "You came." Emily rose quickly, bowing her head. I wasn't sure I should, ma'am. I only did what anyone would have done." Margaret's lips curved. "You still believe that, don't you? That kindness is common?" She reached for Emily's hand, squeezing it gently. "I assure you, child, it is not." Emily flushed, unsure what to say. "I don't deserve thanks." "You're well again, that's what matters." "You deserve thanks," Margaret insisted. "You gave without asking. That is a rare gift." They sat together as tea was served. Emily fumbled with the delicate porcelain cup, unused to such finery, but Margaret spoke kindly, easing her discomfort. Their conversation flowed, not about wealth or power, but about simple things: Emily's work, her brother's love for sketching, her mother's sayings. Margaret listened intently, as though every word mattered. At one point, Margaret said, softly, "You remind me of someone I once knew. A woman with nothing but dignity and love, who became the cornerstone of her family. You carry the same light." Emily's cheeks warmed. "You're too kind." Margaret said firmly, "I am merely truthful." When Emily finally left that afternoon, stepping back into the world of rain-slipped streets and ordinary burdens, she felt unsettled. Not by fear, but by the weight of being truly seen. Margaret watched her from the window, a quiet smile curving her lips. Her instincts were rarely wrong, and now she was certain. This girl, with her soft hands and fierce heart, was meant to bring life back into a family that had grown cold. Margaret's son, Alexander, would resist. He was proud, mistrustful, hardened by business and years of betrayal. But Margaret knew time had a way of weaving souls together, especially when kindness was involved. "Emily Carter," Margaret whispered to herself, "you have no idea what you've stepped into." That night, in her modest kitchen, Emily stirred soup for Jamie, still replaying Margaret's words. She brushed them aside with a shake of her head, focusing on the boy, grinning up at her with his chipped bowl in hand. But fate had already begun to move, and Emily's life was no longer just her own. Emily hesitated at the iron gate, her fingers curled around the damp strap of her worn canvas bag. The Hale estate towered in front of her like a scene from another world. Wide marble steps, arched windows, and trimmed hedges leading to a house that looked more like a palace than a home. The cab that had dropped her off was long gone, and with it, her last sense of familiarity. "Just a thank you," she whispered to herself. Then, back to Noah. The gates slowly opened with a soft, mechanical hum. Emily walked cautiously down the pristine path, rain still clinging to her shoes from the wet sidewalk she'd stood on just hours ago. A butler greeted her at the door, his posture crisp, smile neutral. "Miss Carter, welcome. Mrs. Hale is expecting you." Emily stepped inside and immediately felt the warmth of the interior, not just from the heating, but from the glow of golden chandeliers overhead and the scent of something soft, lavender, maybe jasmine, drifting through the air. Marble floors, velvet furnishings, and portraits of dignified ancestors lined the halls. Every corner of the mansion whispered. She clutched her bag tighter, careful not to leave a scuff on the immaculate floor. Margaret Hale entered the foyer with a gentle smile, dressed in a deep plum cardigan that made her silver hair glow. Her cane clicked softly against the floor as she walked toward Emily. "Dear girl," Margaret said warmly, taking Emily's hands in hers. "You came." "You didn't have to go through so much trouble," Emily replied, her voice soft but honest. "I just did what anyone would have." Margaret's smile deepened. "That's exactly what makes you different." Emily followed her into a sunlit sitting room, though the sky outside was still dim with overcast clouds. Margaret gestured for her to sit on a velvet sofa while the staff brought tea and delicate pastries Emily had only seen in magazines. "I just wanted to thank you properly," Margaret said. "You reminded me that there's still goodness in the world." Emily flushed. "I didn't do anything special." But you did," Margaret said, her eyes twinkling. "You stopped. You helped me when everyone else walked by. That takes heart." As Emily took a careful sip of her tea, she thought about Noah, her younger brother, who was probably finishing his math homework by now in their cramped apartment 2 bus lines away. She'd left him with a neighbor, promising to return soon. Gratitude or not, she couldn't afford to linger long. Just as she was about to politely excuse herself, the door to the sitting room opened again. A tall man in a charcoal suit walked in, removing his watch as he spoke into a Bluetooth earpiece. His hair was jet black, swept back with meticulous care, and his jaw was tense with efficiency. When his eyes fell on Emily, he paused. Margaret's voice rang out, gentle but firm. "Alexander, come meet someone special." Alexander Hale. Emily knew the name. CEO of Hale Enterprises, one of the most influential businessmen on the East Coast. He looked just like the headlines described him, cold, commanding, and impossible to impress. Emily stood awkwardly. "Hi, I'm Emily." Alexander's gaze narrowed, calculating. "I heard you helped my mother." "She saved me," Margaret added proudly. Emily offered a tentative smile, but Alexander's expression didn't change. His eyes moved briefly to her fraying coat and scuffed shoes before returning to her face. "Thank you," he said, but the words held no warmth. Emily nodded, sitting back down as Alexander moved to the bar cabinet and poured himself a glass of water. The silence between them crackled with tension. Margaret tried to ease the atmosphere. Emily's been working 3 jobs to support her younger brother. Imagine that kind of determination. Alexander turned slightly, and yet she still found time to drop everything and rescue a stranger. Remarkable. Emily bit her lip. "I didn't expect anything in return. I just helped." Alexander smiled, but it was tight. "That's admirable, or convenient." Margaret's brows lifted. "Alexander." "Offense," he said, looking directly at Emily. "But people don't usually do things for nothing, especially when they find out the person they saved is a Hale." Emily stood, her voice steady despite the sting. "With all due respect, I didn't know who she was, and even if I had, I still would have helped." Alexander stared at her, then slowly nodded. "Time will tell." Margaret looked visibly displeased with her son's demeanor. "Alexander, would you excuse us?" He nodded once more, gave Emily a final glance, and left the room. Emily sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. "I should go." "Nonsense," Margaret said, her voice soft again. "He's skeptical of everyone. Life at the top does that to a person." "I understand," Emily replied quietly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't. You came because you care, not because you want anything." "That's rare." Emily hesitated. "But I do need to get back to my brother." Margaret smiled knowingly. "Of course, but before you go, would you humor me with a short walk in the garden?" Emily agreed, and they stepped outside onto the terrace. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a glistening world. The garden was vast and breathtaking. Hedges trimmed like artwork, a koi pond shimmering in the center. They walked slowly, Margaret leaning on her cane. "How old is your brother?" 14. "His name's Noah. He's everything to me." "Raising him on your own?" Emily nodded. "Our parents passed a few years ago. It's just the 2 of us now." Margaret's eyes softened with something deeper than pity. It was admiration. "Harry, more than most your age, yet you're still kind." Emily shrugged. "What choice do I have? He depends on me." Margaret paused near a rosebush, her fingers brushing the petals. Some would grow bitter under that kind of pressure. "I've had my days," Emily admitted, "but I remind myself that love is a responsibility, not a burden." The older woman smiled. "And that is why you're different." They stood quietly for a moment, watching as the sunlight finally broke through the clouds. That evening, Emily stepped off the bus and onto the cracked sidewalk near her apartment complex. The scent of fried food from a nearby takeout place clung to the air, mixing with the familiar sounds of car horns and distant sirens. The Hale mansion already felt like a dream she had no business touching. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs and pushed open the peeling wooden door of apartment 3B. "Alex," she called, dropping her bag on the kitchen counter. "Here," his voice came from the living room, followed by the soft clatter of video game controls. Emily entered and found him stretched out on their thrift store couch, a half-eaten sandwich on a paper plate beside him. His curly brown hair stuck out in every direction. "We made grilled cheese," he said proudly. "You're a lifesaver," she said, ruffling his hair. He paused the game. "Where'd you go? That old lady again?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "She invited me to her house to say thank you." Noah raised an eyebrow, like, "Her real house?" "Or like a mansion," she said with a laugh. "It had marble floors, chandeliers, and a butler who called me Miss Carter." His eyes widened. "Who asked? And she's just some regular old lady?" "Exactly," Emily admitted. "Her name's Margaret Hale, and she's kind of a big deal." Noah whistled. "How big?" "Like, her last name is on half the buildings downtown." "Okay," he said slowly, sitting up. "What did she want?" Emily shrugged. "Just to say thank you. I think she's lonely." Noah narrowed his eyes like a detective. "Did she offer you money?" "Tea. And she showed me her garden." He gave her a skeptical look. "So, you're telling me you helped a billionaire granny and she just gave you tea?" Emily smiled. "Some people don't need to give money to show they're grateful." "Still sounds shady," he muttered. "Be careful, Em." She softened. "I know, buddy, but she's sweet, honestly, like a grandma." As they ate dinner together, Emily couldn't shake the image of Alexander Hale from her mind. Those cold eyes, the way he'd looked at her like she was an unwelcome guest, contaminating the air. It stung more than she expected, not because she wanted his approval, but because she wanted to prove she wasn't what he thought. Across town, Margaret sat in her personal study, the fire in the hearth casting a warm glow on the antique furniture. Her hand rested lightly on her cane, but her eyes were fixed on the folder her assistant had just placed in front of her. "Had them look into her background," Margaret said softly. Her assistant, a middle-aged woman named Clara, hesitated. "She's clean," Clara replied. "Emily Carter, 23, parents deceased. Father from a construction accident, mother from leukemia 2 years later. No criminal record. Holds down 3 jobs, one at a cafe, one at a bookstore, and cleaning houses on weekends. Lives with her 14-year-old brother in a modest apartment in East Ridge. She's been his legal guardian for 2 years." Margaret nodded slowly, absorbing every detail. "Her grades were excellent before she dropped out of college," Clara continued. "She left to work full-time and keep custody of her brother. No loans, no debts, no known boyfriends or suspicious contacts. Just trying to survive." Margaret traced a finger over the photo clipped to the front. Emily in her cafe uniform, her smile as soft as her eyes. "She didn't tell me any of this," Margaret murmured. "Of course not," Clara said. "She's not the type." Margaret looked up, a strange light in her eyes. "No, she's not." Clara leaned in. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" Margaret didn't answer. She turned instead toward the window, watching the rain begin to fall again outside. She remembered the moment Emily knelt beside her on that wet sidewalk, not hesitating for even a second to help a stranger. She remembered the gentle way she had spoken, the coat she had given her, the way she didn't care about money or status. "It reminds me of my younger self," Margaret said finally. "Only better." "She's strong," Clara agreed, "but she's not from our world." "That's exactly why she might be the one to heal what this family has broken." Clara blinked. "You mean Alexander?" Margaret sighed. "You saw him with her, defensive, sharp. But did you notice his eyes? He's forgotten how to feel, Clara. He's forgotten what decency looks like. You think Emily could change that? I already did, and he doesn't even know it yet. The two women sat in silence for a moment, the rain soft against the windows. Margaret looked down at the photo again. Make sure she gets invited again. Casually, no pressure, no expectation. Alexander? Margaret's smile was knowing. Let him stew a little, his pride needs to be tested. Clara nodded. Understood. Back at the apartment, Emily was getting ready for bed, brushing her hair as Noah dozed off on the couch. Her thoughts kept drifting to the mansion, to Margaret's kindness, and to the quiet pain behind her eyes. It wasn't just about wealth. That house, for all its splendor, felt hollow. Cold, except when Margaret smiled. And then there was Alexander. The way he dismissed her, the way his gaze seemed to pierce right through her clothes, through her soul, and judge her wanting. She told herself she didn't care, but part of her did. Because, for the first time in a long time, someone had looked at her like she didn't belong. And that hurt more than she wanted to admit. She turned out the light and lay beside Noah, listening to his slow breathing. Whatever came next, she would face it like she always did, with strength, grace, and no expectations. Because she was Emily Carter. And she didn't need to be rich to be worthy. Emily Carter sat on the garden bench beside Margaret Hale, sunlight glinting off the crystal teacups set between them. The grand estate, with its sculpted hedges and singing fountains, still felt like a dream to her. But Emily's posture was relaxed, her fingers curled around a warm porcelain cup as she listened attentively to Margaret's soft laughter. You remind me so much of my younger self, Margaret said fondly. Only, you're stronger. I would have buckled under what you've been through. Emily blushed. You give me too much credit, ma'am. I just do what needs to be done. You do it with grace. That's rarer than you think, Margaret replied, her gaze gentle, almost searching. From a distance, Alexander Hale stood at the library window, watching. His jaw tightened as he saw his mother lean in, brushing a wisp of hair from Emily's face as if she were her own daughter. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He turned from the window and walked back to his desk, muttering to himself. What is she doing here every other day? Why is Mother clinging to her? The next morning, Margaret asked Emily to stay for the evening's family dinner. We always have Friday fret together, she said. Just me and Alexander, though these days it feels like he's only there out of duty. I think you'll bring life to the table. Emily hesitated. I wouldn't want to intrude. Nonsense. You saved me. This is the least I can do. Emily arrived that evening in a modest floral dress. She had borrowed it from her neighbor, carefully ironing out every wrinkle. Her hair was pinned back simply. When she stepped into the grand dining room, her breath caught. The chandelier above shimmered like ice suspended in air, and the long mahogany table stretched forever. Alexander was already seated at the far end, scrolling through emails on his phone. His navy suit was crisp, his expression unreadable. When he looked up and saw Emily, his eyes flickered. Was that surprise or disapproval? Margaret beamed. Emily, darling, sit next to me. Dinner began with polite conversation. Margaret asked Emily about her brother, her work, her dreams. Alexander remained mostly silent, occasionally glancing up with narrowed eyes. When Emily mentioned helping at a local soup kitchen on weekends, his fork paused mid-air. Dear, you work 2 jobs and still volunteer, he asked, tone flat. Emily nodded. It helps me feel useful. Form performative, he muttered under his breath. Margaret caught it. Alexander. He looked up, unapologetic. I'm just curious how someone who claims to be struggling still finds time for charity. Seems convenient. Emily's face flushed. I don't do it for praise, Mr. Hale. I do it because I've been hungry before. Margaret reached for Emily's hand. You don't need to defend yourself. Alexander didn't respond. He looked away, but not before something flickered in his eyes. Shame? Confusion. Later that night, after Emily had gone home, Margaret confronted him in the study. She's genuine, Alec. She's a stranger, he snapped. and you're letting her in like she's family. She saved me, and she didn't ask for a thing. That kind of heart doesn't come around often." He rubbed his temples. "Mother, people pretend, especially when there's money involved." Margaret leaned forward, voice low but firm. "And you've surrounded yourself with those people for so long, you wouldn't recognize sincerity if it knocked on your front door." He flinched. Silence followed. Meanwhile, the next day, Emily stopped by again, this time to bring Margaret a handmade apple pie. "I made it last night. You mentioned you missed your sister's recipe, so I tried my best." Margaret's eyes welled. "You're full of surprises." As Emily waited in the garden, the staff around the estate began noticing her. Chef Morella, a stern woman rarely seen smiling, found herself chuckling as Emily helped her chop vegetables in the kitchen. "You have good hands," she said. Henry, the grizzled gardener, offered Emily a cutting from one of Margaret's favorite rose bushes. "You've brought color back to this place, miss." Even the usually guarded housekeeper, Jeanette, found herself drawn into light-hearted banter as they folded linens together one afternoon. Emily listened more than she spoke, always with warmth, never pretending to be someone she wasn't. Word spread quickly among the staff. Not about some opportunistic girl clinging to wealth, but about a kind soul who saw everyone, no matter their rank. Alexander saw it too. One evening, passing the kitchen, he paused when he heard laughter. Peeking in, he saw Emily perched on a stool, flower on her cheek, laughing with Morella as they shaped dough into hearts. "It reminds me of my sister," Morella said. "She's got that old soul thing," Henry added from the back door. Alexander didn't speak. He just stood in the shadows, arms crossed. Later that night, as he walked down the hallway, he saw Emily and Margaret huddled over an old photo album. Margaret was pointing at a sepia-toned image of herself as a young woman in a sundress. "I used to dance barefoot in those fields," she said. Emily smiled. "You still could." Margaret chuckled. "Only if you promise to catch me." Alexander turned away before they noticed him, something twisted in his chest. He found himself thinking about her more. Not just her laugh or her eyes, but her resilience, her presence, how she filled every room with light. And he hated it. Because that meant admitting he'd been wrong. But pride is a stubborn thing. So, instead, he pulled back further, becoming curt when they crossed paths, brushing past her with cold nods, retreating to his office or meetings. Emily noticed. She wondered if she had done something wrong. One afternoon, she knocked on his study door, gathering her courage. "Mr. Hale?" He didn't look up from his laptop. "Yes? I just wanted to say thank you for letting me spend time with your mother. It's meant a lot." He finally glanced up. "You don't need to thank me. You've already won her over." Emily frowned. "I'm not trying to win anyone." He arched a brow. "Aren't you?" Her breath caught. "If you think I'm here for anything other than friendship and gratitude, then maybe you don't know me at all." She left before he could respond. That night, Alexander sat alone in the study, staring at the fire. In his hand was a photo of his mother as a young woman, barefoot in a field, laughing. Beside it, a smaller photo Emily had gifted Margaret earlier. It showed Emily and her little brother on a thrift store couch, mid-low, wrapped in a quilt. Two very different worlds, but maybe not so different after all. Margaret, alone in her room, stared at the ceiling and whispered, "She's exactly what this family needs, if only he'd open his eyes." Days passed, and the mansion's energy shifted. Margaret continued inviting Emily for meals, garden strolls, and long conversations by the fireplace. The warmth between them grew into something deeper, a bond Margaret hadn't felt in years. She began to depend on Emily, not just for company, but for the feeling of hope she brought into every room. Meanwhile, Alexander grew increasingly uneasy. He found himself watching Emily more than he liked, watching how the staff adored her, how she never acted impressed by luxury or intimidated by status. She remained grounded, always mindful of returning home to her younger brother Ben. One afternoon, Alexander passed the servant quarters and overheard Emily speaking with Jeanette. "I just don't want to forget who I am," Emily said softly. "This place is beautiful, but it's not my world. My brother is—" Jeanette responded kindly. "Sometimes the world changes around us, dear. Doesn't mean you have to lose yourself." Alexander walked away, heart unsettled. That evening, Margaret hosted another dinner, more formal this time. Alexander arrived late, expecting another night of stiff conversation. But when he walked in, Emily was setting the table, carefully folding the napkins in a fan shape. He paused in the doorway. "Why are you doing that? We have staff." Emily looked up, surprised. "Mirella is busy with the roads. I offered to help." He said nothing, just stepped aside as she finished. At the table, Margaret smiled brightly. "Emily's bringing a sense of family back into this house." Alexander let out a dry chuckle. "You mean chaos?" Emily's smile didn't falter. "Maybe a little chaos is what this house needs." Later that night, Margaret called her son into the conservatory. The scent of jasmine floated through the air. "Why are you resisting her so much?" she asked gently. He looked away. "Because I've seen this before. Women pretending to care, using kindness as leverage." "It's not them." "Can you be sure?" "Because she never asked for anything," Margaret said. "She gave without expecting. That's love, Alex, not a transaction." He was silent for a long time. "Then? You want her to stay?" Margaret's smile softened. "More than that, I want her to belong." Alexander shook his head. "You mean?" "I see in her what I hoped your wife would be one day. Not polished or pedigreed, but kind, strong, true. She makes this home feel alive again." His voice caught. "You want me to marry her?" "I want you to see her, really see her, and then decide for yourself." The following days brought unexpected changes. Alexander walked into the kitchen one morning and found Emily teaching Henry how to make French toast. "You're brave," he said dryly, crossing his arms. Emily grinned. "Henry's got a secret talent. Who knew?" Henry winked. "Don't let the boss scare you, girl. He's all bark." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" "Depends," Emily replied, playful but cautious. "Are you always this charming in the mornings?" That caught him off guard. His lips twitched into something dangerously close to a smile. Later, he found her in the greenhouse, trimming dead leaves from a potted orchid. "Do you garden too?" he asked. True. Margaret says plants respond to attention. I think people do too." Their eyes met for a moment, quiet, lingering. "To come here with my mother," Alexander admitted. "She loved orchids." Emily's gaze softened. "I'm sorry." Margaret said she passed. He nodded. "I was 14. Everything changed after that." Emily didn't speak, just placed her hand gently on the soil. Grief does that. From that day, something unspoken shifted between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition of pain, of history, of quiet resilience. Still, pride lingered. One evening, Alexander returned from work to find Margaret and Emily playing cards by the fireplace, laughter echoing through the halls. He stood by the door, unseen. Emily's face was lit with joy. Margaret, radiant with health and affection, looked 10 years younger. He turned and walked away, heart heavy with conflict. The next morning, he cornered Emily in the hallway. "We need to talk," he said. She followed him to the study, where he shut the door behind them. "You've become close to my mother." "Me again." Emily tilted her head. "She's become close to me." "That's the problem," he said. "You're not family. You're not part of this world." Her expression tightened, but she remained calm. "I never claimed to be." "Then why are you here?" Emily took a step forward. "Because she asked me. Because I care about her, and because, despite how cold this house can be, she makes it feel warm." He looked away. "Do you really believe I'm after your money?" she asked. He didn't answer. "I worked 3 jobs. I've cleaned bathrooms, waited tables, folded linens until my hands blistered. If I wanted money, there were easier ways. His silence was louder than any insult. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. You don't know me, Alexander, but I hope someday you'll want to. When she left, he sat alone in the study, fists clenched. That night, Margaret fell ill with a dizzy spell. Emily stayed by her side, holding her hand, placing cool cloths on her forehead. When Alexander arrived home, the doctor was just leaving. Stable now, Emily said softly. He looked at her, eyes clouded. You stayed. Of course I did. He swallowed. The tension between them lingered, but softer now. Fragile. In the days that followed, Alexander watched her more closely, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. She didn't pretend. She didn't try to impress. She simply loved. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The possibility of believing in someone again. One evening, Margaret looked out over the garden as the sun dipped behind the hedges. She's changed everything, hasn't she? She asked her son. Alexander nodded. Yes. And? He met his mother's eyes. I don't know what she is to me yet, but I know she's not who I thought. Margaret smiled. That's a start. As the camera pans out, the Hale estate glows with a new warmth. The staff laugh more. Margaret's health glows. Emily, unaware of the storm she's softened, hums in the kitchen as she sets 2 cups of tea. 2 worlds had clashed, but something beautiful was blooming in the wreckage. And deep down, Alexander Hale was beginning to wonder, what if she was the missing piece all along? The grand chandelier sparkled like 1,000 tiny suns above the ballroom, casting golden light across polished marble and silk gowns. It was a charity gala hosted at the Hale estate, one of the most anticipated evenings in the city's high society calendar. Music drifted through the air like perfume, but beneath the elegance, tensions. Emily stood quietly near the ornate staircase, a simple navy dress hugging her slender frame. She had borrowed it from Margaret's closet at her insistence, though she felt wildly out of place among the jeweled and perfumed guests. Her fingers gripped the stem of a sparkling water flute, not because she wanted to blend in, but to give her trembling hands something to do. Across the room, polished women in designer gowns whispered behind manicured hands. She's the one who picked Margaret up off the street, isn't she? They heard she's from the East Side, single parent, working 2 jobs. Can you imagine? Sweetheart, don't be naive. She's playing the long game. First the sympathy act, then the estate. They laughed behind their wine glasses, their voices dripping with both entitlement and venom. Emily didn't mean to overhear, but she did. Their words slid under her skin like shards of glass. She turned slightly, enough to catch her reflection in the massive mirror near the corridor. Her eyes were too wide, too exposed. Her shoulders, usually held with quiet dignity, now drooped ever so slightly. The music and chatter blurred around her. She didn't belong here, not in this world, not among people who wore judgment like perfume and sprayed it with every glance. Alexander stood not far away, engaged in a conversation with one of his business associates, but his eyes had been watching her. He'd seen the way her expression changed, saw the slight flinch in her jaw, the way her hand slowly placed the untouched glass down on a tray as she backed toward the hallway. But he didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just watched. Emily slipped away from the crowd and wandered through the back corridor, passing portraits and vases that cost more than her yearly income. Her steps were quick, but her heart was quicker. Every word from the ballroom echoed in her chest. Poor girl's scheming sympathy act. Her breath came uneven as she reached the side terrace, pushing open the glass door and letting the cool night air rush against her burning skin. She leaned against the stone rail, blinking back tears. All of it was too much. Margaret had shown her kindness, treated her with more warmth than anyone had in years, but now that kindness had become a spotlight, one that revealed her in all her supposed flaws, too poor, too plain, too unworthy. The door creaked behind her. Emily stiffened, expecting more judgment, perhaps even Alexander to finally come and confirm what the whispers said. But it wasn't Alexander. It was Margaret. Her cane tapped softly on the terrace tiles as she approached, her silver hair caught in the breeze. She said nothing at first, just stood beside Emily and looked out over the gardens bathed in moonlight. "Talk," Margaret said finally. "But they don't know." Emily kept her eyes forward. "They know enough to be right." Margaret turned her head sharply. "No. They know enough to be cruel." Emily swallowed hard. "I didn't come here for this. I didn't ask for any of this." "She know you didn't. I just wanted to help you that night, and you were kind enough to let me visit, to let me into your home. But this attention, the rumors, it's hurting you. It's hurting your reputation." Margaret let out a long sigh, as if tired of fighting the invisible wars of social expectation. "Reputation," she murmured, "a fragile, shallow thing built on silence and fear. I've had enough of both." Emily finally turned to look at her. "But they're your friends, your world." "They are not my world, Emily." "You are," Margaret's voice softened. "When I was on that sidewalk, do you know what I saw? Not just your hands lifting me or your voice calming me. I saw someone who didn't hesitate to help a stranger. No cameras, no applause. Just—" Emily blinked, tears threatening again. "Alexander," Margaret interrupted, a hint of disappointment curling her lips, "is still learning to see. He's smart, brilliant even, but sometimes—" Emily's chest tightened. "He didn't say anything. When they were talking about me, he just stood there?" Margaret's expression darkened. "Yes, and that's a mistake I intend to correct." Silence stretched between them. Emily looked back toward the ballroom, then down at her hands. "I think I should go. I'm not trying to come between you and your son." "You're not," Margaret said firmly. "But if he keeps letting fear speak louder than truth, then he'll lose the best thing that's happened to this house in years." Emily's eyes widened. "You've lit something in this place." The staff smile more. The halls feel warmer. Even Alexander, behind that brooding face, watches you like you're the only puzzle he can't solve. A bitter laugh slipped from Emily's lips. "Some puzzle. Just a girl from the East Side who doesn't belong." Margaret shook her head. "That's where you're wrong. You do belong, not because of what you wear or what you own, but because of who you are." Emily closed her eyes. She wanted to believe her, desperately, but those whispers, those cutting, venomous voices, they had found their way into her ribs. "I'm afraid I'll break something just by being here." Margaret reached out and took her hand. "Then let it be the silence. Let it be the coldness that's ruled this place for too long." Inside the mansion, the ballroom spun on in gold and glitter, but on the terrace, something stronger than elegance took root. Truth resolved in something fragile but growing. The next morning, the mansion was unusually quiet. Margaret sat at the head of the long breakfast table, stirring her tea slowly but not drinking it. Her expression was unreadable on the surface, but beneath it a storm gathered. The staff moved silently around her, sensing her mood like animals before thunder. No one spoke. No one dared. Alexander arrived a few minutes later, buttoning his cufflinks, already on a call. He paused when he saw his mother sitting alone. "Mother," he greeted casually, still distracted, "didn't expect you up so early after last night." Margaret set her spoon down, her eyes narrowing. "We need to talk. Now." Alexander glanced at her, caught off guard by her tone. He ended the call mid-sentence. "Everything all right?" she said crisply. "Sit." He obeyed slowly, brows furrowed. The last time Margaret Hale used that voice, half the board resigned within the month. "We assumed you heard what was said about Emily last night," she said. Alexander leaned back, folding his arms. "I heard chatter, people being people. People being cruel," she corrected. "She's not from our world, Mother. That's not cruelty, it's reality." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her cup but didn't lift it. "No, Alexander. That's cowardice." He stiffened. "Excuse me?" "You stood there," she continued, her voice icy now. "You saw her face crumble. You saw her leave the room. And you said nothing." Alexander's jaw clenched. What was I supposed to do? Start a scene at a gala? Defend a girl I barely know in front of half the city's elite? Margaret snapped. That is exactly what you should have done. The silence between them was sharp. She is not a girl you barely know, she continued. She is someone who helped a dying woman in the street when no one else did. Someone who listens to the housekeeper's stories, who brings flowers to the gardener's sick wife, who makes this house feel less like a museum and more like a home. You know her, Alexandra. You just refuse to admit it. He looked away. You're romanticizing her. You always do this. Attach meaning where there is none. Margaret's next words cut like glass. You're afraid, his eyes snapped back. Of what? Of needing someone. Of caring. Of letting someone close enough to see who you really are, beneath all that armor. Alexander's voice dropped. That's not fair. No one said this, Margaret whispered. What's not fair is that girl crying alone on my terrace while you stood frozen with pride. His hands tightened into fists on the table. You don't know what I know you feel something, she said gently, and you're running from it. The words sat between them, heavy and undeniable. Wanted you to meet someone who sees past your bank accounts and your last name, Margaret said, softer now. Emily never asked for anything, she only gave. He didn't answer. Was going to leave this morning, Margaret added, rising from her chair. I had to beg her to stay the night. Not for me, for her brother. She didn't want him to think she did something wrong. Alexander's eyes flickered. She thinks she's the problem? He murmured. Margaret nodded. Because we let her feel that way. With that, she walked away, her cane tapping a slow rhythm against the tiles, leaving her son alone in the silence he had created. Emily stood in the guest room, folding her few clothes into her canvas bag. The gown from last night was already hung neatly back in the closet, as if she had never worn it. She had made up her mind. She would leave before breakfast. Slip away quietly, take the train home, and call it a lesson in kindness gone too far. Her chest still ached from the night before, but she reminded herself that she was good at surviving heartbreaks. She had survived worse. Just as she zipped her bag, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Alexander standing there. Not in a suit, not on his phone, just standing. He looked almost unsure of himself. I heard you were leaving, he said. Emily nodded. It's better this way. For who? Everyone. He stepped inside the room and closed the door gently behind him. Emily, I should have said something. Last night, I saw you walk out, and I just stood there. She kept her eyes down. It's okay, he said, stepping closer. It's not. There was a pause, the kind that holds everything unsaid. You didn't know what to do, he admitted. I told myself it wasn't my business, that you didn't need me to step in, but the truth is, I was scared. Emily looked up then. Scared of what? He met her gaze. Of how I felt, of what you make me feel. She swallowed hard. You think feelings change what people see when they look at me? I'm still the same girl from the east side with a part-time job and a second-hand coat. I'm still the man who hasn't felt anything real in years, he said, voice low. Until you... Her eyes shimmered. You let them think I was using you, that I wanted something from your mother. I know, he whispered. And I hate that I didn't stop them. But I'm here now, not because of what my mother said, because of what I feel. Emily blinked back tears, unsure if she wanted to believe him. Say the word, he said, and I'll walk you out if that's what you need. But if you stay, I promise you'll never stand alone again. The silence stretched. Then, I'm not fragile, Emily said quietly. I just wanted someone to see me for who I really am. I see you now, he said, and I'm sorry it took so long. Her lips parted as if to speak, but instead she stepped forward and hugged him, not with passion, but with a quiet exhaustion, a surrender, a release. He held her like something precious. Somewhere down the hall, Margaret Hale smiled to herself. She had always believed in storms, because she knew what came after. The soft rustle of sheets and the rhythmic beep of medical monitors filled the private room in the Hale estate. Margaret lay pale and still, her silver hair fanned across the pillow like wisps of snow. Emily sat beside her, clutching her hand, whispering gentle words no one else could hear. She hadn't meant to come back. After the whispers, after the stares, after Alexander Hale's silence when the crowd tore into her. She had told herself it was better to walk away, clean, proud, untouched. But when the butler showed up at her tiny apartment, breathless and nervous, saying Margaret had collapsed again, Emily hadn't hesitated. Her brother, Liam, had seen it in her eyes. He'd simply nodded and said, "She needs you more than I do right now." Now, she didn't think about the mansion's icy halls or the eyes that judged her. All she thought about was the frail hand in hers and the woman who had looked at her not with pity, but with quiet affection. "You're stronger than you look, Margaret," she whispered, "but I need you to fight." From the hallway, Alexander watched. He hadn't expected her to come. In truth, he hadn't expected her to care. But she did, more than anyone else ever had. The doctor stepped out of the room and Alexander stopped him. "She'll be fine," the doctor said. "She needs rest and warmth, but emotionally, I think what's saving her now isn't medicine." Alexander's gaze shifted back to the girl by his mother's side. That night, rain whispered against the windows as Emily sat in the dim light, reading aloud from a weathered novel Margaret had once loved. The words were soft, her voice trembling only when Margaret stirred, just barely. In the kitchen downstairs, Alexander wandered, restless. The silence was too heavy. He wasn't used to silence, not like this, not in a home filled with so many walls and yet so little warmth. He found himself reaching for the kettle. It felt strange, out of character. He hadn't made tea in years, not since his father passed, not since the world taught him success was built on steel and solitude. The tea whistled, and just as he poured it, a sound startled him. Soft footsteps, then her voice. Couldn't sleep either. Emily stood in the doorway, still wearing the cardigan she'd borrowed earlier, her eyes tired but gentle. Alexander cleared his throat. "I was just making tea." She smiled, faintly. "Looks like you haven't forgotten how." Bringing her 2 children toward him. "I used to make it for my mother," he admitted, almost ashamed. "When I was little, she used to say I made it too strong." Emily chuckled and reached for a second mug. "She says the same about me." They sat at the small round table. The same table where Alexander had often reviewed contracts, signed mergers, made deals worth millions. Now, he sat across from a girl who made sandwiches at a corner cafe and still wore shoes with soles nearly worn through. "I didn't expect you to come back," he said finally. Emily looked down. "Neither did I." "So why?" "She's more than just someone I helped once," Emily replied. "She's been kind to me, seen me when others didn't bother looking." Alexander stared at the steam rising from his cup. "You know, people talk, and sometimes I listen." Her voice was steady, though her fingers trembled slightly around the mug. "I know, I heard them too." He looked up. "And you stayed?" she said, "because she needed me, not because I wanted anything." He nodded slowly, the silence thick with things he didn't know how to say. "You were wrong about me," she added softly. "And maybe I was wrong about you too." That hit deeper than he expected. They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the rain tap against the windows, the way it had the first night she found Margaret on the street. Full circle, and yet something had shifted. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a stranger or an outsider or a threat, but as someone who had stayed when she had every reason to walk away. "Do you miss your family?" he asked suddenly. Emily blinked, surprised. "It's just me and Liam. He's only 13. Smart as anything, though. Thinks I'm the strongest person alive." "I'm starting to see why," she smiled. "We had to grow up fast. Our parents died when I was 18. I've been doing my best since then." The truth in her words humbled him. Margaret stirred upstairs, and they both stood. "You should get some rest," he said. She shook her head roughly. She replied, but neither moved. "Good night, Alexander." He hesitated, then "Good night, Emily." She turned to go, and as she walked away, he felt something in his chest he hadn't in years. The next morning, Margaret woke to find Emily curled on the chair beside her bed, her hand still resting gently on hers. The old woman's voice was raspy but playful. "That boy finally making tea again?" Emily jolted awake, then smiled. "Yes, and it wasn't half bad." Margaret chuckled, then coughed, but there was a spark in her eyes. That afternoon, Alexander brought in a tray of soup, surprising even the nurses. Margaret watched the two of them interact, quiet glances, shy smiles, and though neither said anything aloud, she saw it happening. The walls were starting to melt. She sipped her tea and whispered to herself, "Took him long enough?" The following days passed gently, like snow melting into spring. Emily remained at Margaret's side, keeping her company not just as a caregiver, but as someone who genuinely cared. She read aloud during the quiet afternoons, brought fresh flowers from the greenhouse each morning, and sometimes just sat in peaceful silence, letting Margaret nap with her hand in hers. It was during one of those quiet moments that Alexander lingered just beyond the doorway, unnoticed. He watched as Emily tucked a soft blanket over his mother's legs, smoothing it with the care of someone who expected nothing in return. Her tenderness was unforced. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to impress. And for the first time in a long while, Alexander began to question everything he thought he knew about people, especially about her. Later that evening, he found himself wandering into the library, a room he rarely entered since his father passed. The air smelled faintly of old paper and cedar. He stood in front of the fireplace, watching flames dance, then turned when the door creaked open. "You know that, Emily?" "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said. She stepped carefully across the Persian rug, her fingers trailing along the edge of a bookcase. "Your mother told me you used to read to her in here when you were a boy." Alexander gave a soft, nostalgic smile. "She used to say, I brought the characters to life better than the radio ever could." "She still believes that," Emily said. "She misses hearing your voice." There was a pause. "I miss hearing hers," he said, his voice lower now. "Before the illness, before the distance." Emily sat on the edge of one of the leather chairs. "It's not too late to close that distance, Alexander." He looked at her. "How do you do that?" "To what house speak like you know people's hearts?" Emily offered a sad smile. "Maybe, because I've had to listen closely my whole life, just to survive." The truth of that hit him harder than he expected. "I was wrong about you," Alexander said. Emily didn't react right away. Then she whispered, "I know." Silence fell again, but this time, it wasn't heavy, it was honest. From that day forward, something subtle shifted in the mansion. Alexander no longer kept his distance. He joined them for breakfast, offering Emily fresh fruit with a quiet word of thanks. He began walking through the gardens again, sometimes finding her there with Margaret, tending to the roses or feeding the koi in the pond. Occasionally, he'd sit beside them, even offer a wry joke that made Margaret laugh so hard she'd tear up. Emily noticed the change, but she didn't point it out. She let it happen naturally. One morning, as they sat under the arbor, Margaret dozing in a wheelchair beside them, Alexander finally spoke what had been on his mind. "You've changed things here." "And me?" Tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "This house used to feel like marble and silence, cold, formal, empty. And now? Now it feels like someone opened a window." Emily chuckled. "Maybe it just needed fresh air." They sat quietly for a while, watching dragonflies skim the surface of the fountain. Then Alexander said, "You make her happy. I care about her." "That's rare. People usually care about what she can give them." Emily turned to him. "Maybe that's why she let me in, because I never asked for anything." He looked down. "You remind me of my father." Her breath caught. "Really?" "He came from nothing, built everything himself, but he never let money harden him. You would have liked him." "I think I would have." Alexander met her gaze. "He would have liked you too." That moment lingered in the garden air, unspoken, soft but unmistakable. Later that night, Margaret called Emily to her room. "I saw the way he looked at you today," she said. Emily blushed. "Margaret, I'm not blind, dear. Not to love, or to pride. He's thawing, slowly, but it's happening. Oh." Emily sat on the edge of the bed, brushing back a loose strand of Margaret's hair. "He's trying. That's enough for me." Margaret smiled, then reached out and squeezed Emily's hand. "I brought you here because you reminded me what kindness looks like," she whispered. "But now, I wonder if fate brought you here for something much deeper." Emily blinked. "You mean?" Margaret just smiled and closed her eyes. Down the hall, Alexander stood just outside the doorway, having caught every word. That night, he stayed up late in his father's study, looking at old photo albums. One of them showed his parents dancing barefoot on the lawn, carefree young. Another showed his mother, with her hands in the dirt, planting roses, the same ones Emily now tended. He looked at the photos, then closed the album slowly. The next morning, when Emily came downstairs, she found a small box on the kitchen table. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, simple but elegant. Beside it, a note in neat handwriting. "The girl who made our house feel like a home again." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. And upstairs, Margaret Hale watched the whole thing from the balcony, heart full. The cracks in the ice had widened, and spring was just beginning. The morning sun had barely risen when the front gates of the Hale estate were swarmed by flashing cameras. Tabloid vans idled just outside the iron bars, their engines humming like hungry wolves waiting for prey. Headlines had broken overnight. Emily's face, captured from a blurred zoom shot, was now plastered on every gossip site in town. "From waitress to heiress," screamed one article. Another was crueler. "She saved a life, then claimed a fortune." At the mansion, Emily stared at the tablet in her trembling hands. The article mocked her kindness, twisting it into ambition. They printed lies, half-truths laced with venom, suggesting she had maneuvered her way into the estate, into Margaret's life, and now into Alexander's. One picture showed her pouring tea beside Margaret's bed. Another captured her in the garden, smiling at one of the staff. To the outside world, it looked curated, staged, but to Emily, those moments were the only real ones she'd ever had. Her stomach twisted. She felt exposed, painted as something she never was. And the worst part? No one had defended her. Not publicly, not even Alexander. Downstairs, Alexander Hale's phone vibrated relentlessly. The boardroom was full, and his business partners stared across the long table with grim expressions. One of them, Milton Davies, cleared his throat. "We've seen the news, Alexander," he began, tapping the screen of his tablet. "It's everywhere. Your association with that girl, it's causing reputational risk." Alexander's jaw tightened. "That girl saved my mother's life." Another partner interjected. "And now she's living under your roof, being treated like family. Public perception matters. Investors are uneasy. We're not questioning your personal life, but this affects the Hale legacy." Alexander stood up, hands braced against the edge of the table. "She's not some opportunist," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "She never asked for any of this." Devonly. "Then why is she still here?" Milton challenged. "Tabloids don't just invent things out of thin air." Alexander didn't respond, because deep down, a sliver of doubt still festered. Not about her character, no, he had begun to believe in that, but about the world she'd been dragged into, and whether she could survive it. Emily folded the letter slowly, her hands leaving creases that mirrored the ache in her chest. It was written on pale blue stationery, the kind Margaret kept in a carved wooden box beside her bed. She hadn't intended to use it, but this goodbye deserved something more than a scribbled note. She'd poured her gratitude into each line, thanking Margaret for her kindness, her warmth, her unwavering belief. She made no mention of Alexander. That silence hurt the most. She placed the envelope gently on the nightstand beside Margaret's favorite cup of tea. Then she stepped back, her small suitcase resting beside the door. Her heart screamed, but her feet moved. She reached the foyer just as the rain began outside, soft but insistent. She pulled her coat tighter, her hand on the doorknob when his voice stopped her. "Emily." Alexander said, his footsteps echoing behind her. Where are you going? She turned slowly, eyes already shimmering. Where I should have stayed all along. He walked closer, hands clenched at his sides. Is this because of the articles? My business partners? She gave a hollow laugh. No, Alexander, this is because I don't belong here. I was never meant to. That's not true. Tuously, isn't it? She whispered, voice cracking. You said nothing when people whispered. You let them paint me as some scheming girl trying to take your family's name. You stood in silence, and that silence screamed louder than any insult. His throat worked as if trying to swallow words too sharp to speak. I didn't know what to say. She cut him off, stepping forward. I wasn't asking you to defend me like a knight in shining armor. I was asking you to see me, to see that I was trying to be kind, to care, to help her. Not for gain, not for fame, just because I love her. The word slipped before she could pull it back. Love. Alexander blinked. You love her? Emily nodded, biting her lip. She's the only one who ever looked at me like I was worth something. Not out of pity, not out of status, just seen. And now they've turned that into a spectacle. I can't stay here and let them use her name to shame her generosity. Slowly she turned. You think I don't care? He said, voice rising. You think I haven't watched you bring life into this house, warmth into her days, laughter into our dinners? She looked up, surprised. He stepped closer. Was wrong, Emily, he said, softer now. I misjudged you. At first I thought you were a threat, then I thought you were a mistake. But now, he faltered. Now what? She whispered. Now I realize I can't bear the thought of this house without your voice echoing through it. Or seeing my mother smile the way she does when you walk in. Or watching you pray for her when you think no one's watching. Tears spilled freely now. Emily stepped back. Don't do this. Don't make it harder. After a moment, I'm not trying to trap you, he said, chest heaving. I'm trying to stop you from leaving before I've said the one thing that matters. A voice came from the stairs. She was never a guest, Margaret said weakly, leaning on her cane, her face pale but determined. She was always more. They both turned to see her descending slowly, each step measured but firm. Margaret reached them, her eyes steady on her son. I brought her here because she reminded me what grace looks like, what real character means. And I kept her here because I saw in her the kind of strength even this family has forgotten. Emily wiped her cheeks, her hands trembling. I never meant to hurt anyone, she whispered. You haven't, Margaret said, but the world will try to punish people who shine without permission. And her looked between them. Mother, Margaret took Emily's hand. I hoped one day you'd see what I've seen from the beginning, that this girl, this woman, is not a guest in our lives. She's a part of it, a part I prayed you'd be brave enough to keep. Emily looked down, her heart in pieces. She had wanted nothing more than to feel worthy. But in this moment, standing between truth and pride, she didn't know what to do. And Alexander, for the first time in years, looked uncertain too, not because of doubt, but because of the weight of what he could lose. The silence hung thick in the room as Emily looked from Margaret to Alexander, her heart pounding like a drum caught between thunder and surrender. Her never wanted to cause problems, Emily whispered, her voice cracking. Your world, it's not mine. Maybe it should be, Margaret said gently, never releasing her hand. Not because of money or appearances, but because you've brought something into this home that no amount of wealth ever could. Truth allows. Emily shook her head, eyes flickering toward the suitcase still by the door. Even if your heart says that, the world outside doesn't care. They only see what they want to. A girl who rose too fast, who dared to step beyond her station. And I'm tired of proving them. Alexander stepped forward, slowly, as if walking on the edge of something fragile. Then don't prove anything to them. Prove it to me. Stay. Let me try to make this right. You can't fix this with an apology, she said, wiping her eyes. You didn't believe me when it mattered. I know, he replied, and his voice was quiet, stripped of power, of pretense. I saw you as a threat to the life I'd built, rigid, calculated, safe. But you weren't a threat. You were a mirror. You showed me everything I had been too blind to see. Emily looked away, but not before a tear slid down her cheek. And now? Alexander whispered. I see you, and I hate myself for not seeing sooner. Margaret smiled softly, stepping aside as if giving them space to meet halfway. But Emily didn't move. She stared at the floor, her voice trembling. I don't want to be someone's redemption story. I'm not here to fix wounds I didn't cause. I wanted to help, to serve, to matter. On my own terms. You matter, Alexander said, his voice hoarse. Not because you saved my mother, not because you were kind to the staff or gracious with our family, but because you are you, and somewhere between pushing you away and watching you leave, I realized I don't want to imagine a single day without you in it. The words hung there, trembling between them, stripped of elegance, raw and unvarnished. Emily looked up, her heart in a storm. And if the world doesn't change, if the whispers grow louder, if your board turns on you, let them, he said, stepping closer. Let them talk, let them rage. I'd rather lose their approval than live another day pretending I'm whole. Without you. Emily's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Why now? Because this, he gestured between them, was never about timing. It was about fear, mine, and you deserve better than a man ruled by fear. He reached out, not to take her hand, but to offer his. Will you stay? The question wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was whispered like a promise, gentle as hope. Emily looked at his hand, then at Margaret, whose eyes shimmered with emotion. And then she stepped back. Time, she said, not to think, but to heal. Alexander nodded slowly, his hand falling back to his side. Then, I'll wait. She turned toward the door and opened it. The rain had stopped. The sky was still gray, but it no longer felt heavy-hooked, just quiet, like the breath between storms. Before stepping out, she looked back one last time. Thank you for finally seeing me. And with that, she walked out, not in anger, not in heartbreak, but in clarity. Alexander stood still, watching her go, the weight of truth settling on his shoulders. Margaret moved to stand beside him. She'll come back, she said. He looked at her, broken but hopeful. How do you know? Because, Margaret whispered, smiling faintly, you gave her a reason to... Outside, Emily walked slowly down the long drive, the gravel crunching beneath her feet. The air was cool, touched with a breeze that brushed her face like a memory. She didn't know where she was headed, but for the first time, she wasn't running. She was walking toward herself. Back inside the house, Alexander picked up the letter Emily had left by Margaret's tea. He read it in silence, each word etched with gratitude, humility, and a love so quiet it almost went unnoticed. He pressed it to his chest, and for a long moment said nothing. Later that night, the storm returned. Thunder rolled softly in the distance, not violent, just steady. A lullaby for the wounded. Alexander sat alone in the kitchen, the light from the stove casting golden shadows on the walls. The same kitchen where Emily once made tea. He poured a cup, sat in silence, and waited. Because love, when real, doesn't chase. It waits with open doors, steady hands, and the hope that someday, someone will walk through it. Rain pelted the roof of the small countryside train station, each drop sounding like a ticking clock against the faded tin. Emily sat on the worn bench, her coat pulled tightly around her as wind curled through the cracks in the walls. Her suitcase rested at her feet, soaked along the edges. The air smelled of earth and regret. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the warmth. The last few days had been a whirlwind. Since leaving the Hale estate, she'd returned to her small apartment, packed her things, and quietly handed off her part-time job to a friend. There had been no dramatic goodbyes, just silence. No one had noticed, and yet her heart still beat with the echo of Alexander's words and Margaret's smile. She didn't belong in that world, not truly. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the horizon, low and long. The digital display above the platform flickered. 15 minutes until the train. She lowered her head into her hands, whispering to herself, "It's better this way." The sound of hurried footsteps broke the quiet. Emily lifted her head just as the doors burst open, and there he was. Alexander stood in the doorway, rain cascading down his coat, breath heavy from running. His eyes locked on hers, filled with desperation, with something raw and unguarded. "If you left without saying goodbye." Emily stood slowly, her heart leaping into her throat. "I didn't think I needed to." He stepped forward, his voice rough. "You didn't just leave the house, Emily. You left me. You left us." "Leave us know us," she whispered, forcing her hands to stay by her sides. "There never was." Alexander exhaled slowly, rain dripping from his hair. "That's not true, and you know it." "I know what the tabloids said. I know what your business partners think. I know what people whispered at your dinners. I was never meant to stay." He shook his head. "Don't let their voices drown out the truth." She looked away, jaw tight. "What truth?" "Answered me." The words hit her like a wave. Without you," Alexander said softly, "and I didn't come here out of guilt. I came because the moment you walked out of my life, I realized just how empty it had always been. I built everything on pride, success, appearances. But none of it meant anything, not without you." Emily's eyes shimmered, but she didn't speak. "You taught me," he continued, stepping closer, "what wealth could never buy. Humility, kindness, grace. You didn't ask for anything, and you gave everything. You saw my mother as more than a name. You saw me as more than my flaws. And He paused as she wrapped her arms around herself. "And what now? You show up in the rain, say pretty words, and expect everything to be fixed?" He said, swallowing hard. "I don't expect anything, but I couldn't let you leave without knowing that I see you now. Fully. Completely." A flash of lightning illuminated the station. For a moment, they both stood still in the flickering light. "Still scared," Emily admitted, her voice a whisper. "Not of you, but of what people will say, of what they'll do to me again." "Then let them talk," Alexander said. "Let the world rage. I'll be the one beside you through every storm." The door creaked again. They turned. Margaret stood in the entryway, supported by a driver holding an umbrella, her frame frail but her eyes fiery with purpose. Emily gasped, "You shouldn't be out." Margaret waved off the concern. "When something matters, darling, you show up for it. Rain or not." The driver helped her to the bench. She sat slowly, catching her breath, then looked between the two of them. "You were leaving again," Margaret said, her gaze on Emily. "I didn't want to cause more pain," Emily replied, guilt washing over her. "Pain," Margaret said gently. "You healed it." Emily blinked back tears. "Then why does it feel like I broke everything?" "Because people like us," Margaret said, reaching for her hand. "We carry too much. But it's time you set that down." She looked over at her son. "And you, Alexander, you nearly lost the best thing that ever happened to you." He lowered his head, ashamed. Margaret's voice trembled. "I may not have years left, but I know what I want them filled with, and it isn't quiet dinners or hollow parties. It's laughter in the kitchen. It's honesty at the table. It's someone who makes us better just by existing." She turned back to Emily, squeezing her hand. "You are the daughter I always wanted, and the woman my son truly needs." Emily broke then. Her composure, her fear, it all crumbled into tears. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she whispered. "You already are," Margaret replied, smiling. The storm outside seemed to still for a moment, just long enough. Alexander stepped forward again, no longer the aloof heir or the powerful businessman, but a man standing bare with only his heart. "I don't want you to stay because you owe me anything," he said, "or because of Margaret. I want you to stay because you want to. Because—" Emily looked up, eyes wide with the first shimmer of hope since she left. "Of you," he said again, softer this time. "Not as a project, not as a guest, but as my equal, my partner, my heart. He held out his hand once more, just like before, but this time with no expectations, only choice. Emily stared at it, then at Margaret's encouraging smile. And slowly she stepped forward, her hand slid into his. He pulled her gently into his arms, and beneath the flicker of stormlight, they kissed, slow and full of everything unsaid. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was something better, it was real. The storm outside softened to a steady rhythm, a backdrop to the warmth now blooming inside the old train station. Emily stayed in Alexander's arms longer than she meant to, but for the first time in days, she wasn't thinking about time, or fear, or what the world would say. She was just feeling. Margaret cleared her throat gently, her signature mischievous look returning. Well, if you two are finished making the rest of us feel like third wheels. Emily laughed, the sound bright and real, surprising even herself. Alexander smiled too, his arm still gently around her waist. You should be resting. All right, when I see the two of you stop being so stubborn, Margaret replied with a raised brow. Now, shall we go home? Emily's eyes flickered, uncertain. Home? Margaret rose slowly, and for a moment she looked every bit the matriarch she once was. Regal, commanding, full of grace. Yes, dear, home. The mansion may be large, cold even, but it hasn't felt like home in years, not until you walked in. Don't deny it. Emily glanced at Alexander, then back at Margaret. But everything that happened, the press, the whispers, your health, life will always come with noise, Margaret said, stepping closer. You don't silence it by running away, you do it by choosing what matters more. Emily felt her throat tighten again. Are you sure? Margaret smiled. I've never been more sure of anything. The driver approached, offering Margaret his arm again. As she steadied herself, she turned to Alexander and Emily. You two take the other car. I want a nap without hearing your awkward flirting. Alexander chuckled under his breath, but Emily's cheeks flushed with heat. We weren't flirting. Margaret just smirked, as she was helped back outside. Once the door shut behind her, Alexander looked at Emily. You don't have to decide everything tonight. I already have, she said softly. I just needed to hear it from both of you. They walked side by side through the light rain toward the waiting car. The mist clung to their coats, but it didn't matter. Nothing felt cold anymore. As they drove, silence hung between them, but it wasn't heavy like before. It was comforting, peaceful. Emily stared out the window at the winding roads, her heart no longer aching but mending. Stitch by stitch. What she needed. Do you remember? Alexander finally said. The first time you sat at the dinner table with my mother. Emily nodded. I spilled water on her napkin and nearly cried. It will be later that night, he said with a faint smile, that it was the first time in years she laughed like that. Emily turned toward him. She made me feel like I belonged before I believed it myself. Alexander reached for her hand, resting gently over the console. We both needed you, Emily, more than we ever admitted. She didn't pull away. By the time they reached the estate, the storm had completely passed. The driveway glistened under the moonlight, and the trees that once felt ominous now stood like quiet sentinels, welcoming her back. The staff greeted them at the door, warm smiles and nods replacing the stiff politeness of the past. It was as if everything had shifted, not because Emily had changed, but because she had changed them. They went to the drawing room, where Margaret lay resting on the chairs with a blanket over her knees. A soft fire crackled nearby, casting golden light across her face. You're back, she murmured, eyes half-lidded. Alexander leaned down, kissing her forehead. And not going anywhere. Margaret's lips curved faintly. Good, then I can sleep. As she drifted off, Emily sat beside her on the floor, her back to the hearth, watching the woman who had changed her life with nothing more than kindness and tea. She's the reason I stayed, Emily whispered. Alexander knelt beside her. And you're the reason she's still fighting. They looked at each other again, the silence now filled with understanding. Alexander spoke softly. I don't want a future built on status or legacy anymore. I want one built on things that last." "Like what?" Emily asked. Actress. Laughter. "Nights like this, where everything is simple and true. Like us." She bit her lip. "I've never been someone people expected to end up in a place like this. Maybe that's why you're exactly who this place needed," he said. Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. "You've changed." "No," he said. "I finally became someone who deserved you." They sat together for a long time, not needing much. Later that night, Margaret awoke briefly, catching sight of the two of them asleep on the rug by the fire, her son with his arm protectively around the woman he once doubted, and Emily curled into his side, no longer holding back. She smiled, content. Her last thought before drifting back to sleep was simple and full of peace. Finally, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Hale estate, no longer a place of silence and old regrets, but of gentle chaos and new beginnings. The air was filled with laughter, the kind that seemed to dance along the corridors, brushing away years of loneliness from every dusty corner. Emily Carter knelt in the garden, hands buried in the soil beside her younger brother Jamie, who was now grinning ear to ear as he carefully watered a row of blooming lavender. His cheeks were rounder, healthier than they had been in months. His eyes, once tired from long nights alone while his sister worked multiple jobs, now sparkled with the mischievous joy of a boy who finally had a child. "Too much water," Emily gently warned, smiling as she brushed a stray curl from his forehead. Jameis asked. Jamie giggled. "But they're thirsty." "Even thirsty flowers can drown, silly." From the stone patio, Margaret Hale sat in a cushioned chair, a knitted shawl around her shoulders. She looked healthier, more vibrant, though still fragile in the way time insists upon. Yet it wasn't medicine that had brought the color back to her cheeks. It was the presence of something far more healing. Family. Her eyes stayed fixed on the two figures in the garden. Emily, patiently tending to Jamie, and Alexander standing just a few paces away, sleeves rolled, awkwardly holding a small shovel, like a man unfamiliar with dirt but determined to learn. It had been several months since that rainy evening at the train station, when hearts were laid bare and walls came tumbling down. Since then, the mansion had changed, not just in decoration or routine, but in energy. It pulsed with life again. Margaret sipped her tea, savoring the warmth, and glanced toward Emily with a quiet pride. There had been a time when this house echoed with nothing but sterile silence, formal dinners, and polite small talk. Now it echoed with piano keys from Jamie's lessons, with soft footsteps running down halls with late-night cocoa and whispers of dreams. She never imagined she'd get to see her home transformed not by architects, but by hearts. Alexander stepped forward, brushing dirt from his hands with mild embarrassment. "I think your brother's a better gardener than I'll ever be," he muttered to Emily. She smiled without looking up. "He's got good instincts. You're still figuring out the difference between weeds and vegetables." Alexander exhaled a dry laugh. "Guilty." There was a pause, a peaceful one. "I can't believe how much he's changed," Alexander said after a moment, watching Jamie chase a butterfly across the lawn. "Peace. Just needed peace," Emily replied softly. "And safety. He's never had that before." "Wouldn't she?" Alexander asked, his voice quieter now. "Did you ever get peace?" Emily turned to him then, brushing her hands on her apron. "It's not something I ever thought I'd find." The moment lingered. It was not the tense, brittle silence of their early meetings, nor the uncertain warmth of a budding bond. It was a stillness full of understanding, built on shared experience and mutual care. They had both changed, not just in how they saw each other, but in how they saw themselves. Laying outside, he reached into his pocket then, fingers brushing against something small and cool. He looked nervous. He hadn't planned to do it this way, but watching Emily now, surrounded by love, patience, and joy, he knew there would never be a perfect moment. Only an honest one. He stepped closer. "Emily." She looked up again. "I've spent most of my life around people who say all the right things," he began. "Polished words, perfect manners, but never truth. You never tried to impress me, you just showed me who you are. And because of that, I saw who I've been pretending to be. Emily's breath caught. I don't want a life of pretending anymore, he continued, his voice trembling just slightly. Not in business, not in this house, and not with you. From the patio, Margaret watched as Alexander slowly knelt down in the soft garden soil, one knee pressing into the earth. Emily's eyes widened, hands frozen mid-mission as he revealed a small, elegant ring. A single sapphire, surrounded by delicate diamonds. It wasn't loud or extravagant, it was simple, thoughtful, sincere. Emma, I'm not asking you because my mother wants it, Alexander said. I'm asking you because I do, because I can't imagine this house without your laughter, or this garden without your hands, or my life without your heart. Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. She didn't speak at first. Words felt too small for the storm of emotion inside her. The girl who once worked 3 jobs to keep her brother fed, who had been mocked, doubted, and discarded by strangers, was now being asked to be part of something she never thought she'd have. A future filled with love and family. She nodded, and then laughed through the tears. Yes. Alexandra exhaled with relief, sliding the ring onto her finger. Jamie, catching the moment out of the corner of his eye, let out a whoop and ran to tackle them both in a hug, knocking them into the grass. From her chair, Margaret wiped at the corner of her eye. Her vision blurred, not from age but from joy. She had found her daughter. Her family was whole. She whispered to herself, "Now I can rest." Later that afternoon, the celebration continued in the garden. Margaret insisted on staying outside, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her from the sun as the breeze rustled the trees. A soft quilt was spread across the lawn, topped with tea, tarts, fresh fruit, and a batch of Emily's lemon scones that had become the household favorite. Emily sat beside Margaret, her fingers absently brushing over the ring, now glinting on her hand. She still couldn't believe it. The weight of it, not in gold or stone, but in meaning, felt surreal. She looked up to see Jamie trying to teach Alexander how to properly skip stones into the small fountain near the hedge. He was terrible at it, and laughing. "Do you remember," Margaret said softly, "the first night you arrived here?" Emily smiled. "How could I forget? I was soaked, shivering, and absolutely certain your driver was going to toss me off the estate." Margaret chuckled. "I remember thinking, this girl walks like she's afraid to take up space. But I saw something in you, even then. Grace, fire, kindness." She looked at Emily with warm eyes. "You brought this house back to life." Emily's throat tightened. "You gave me a chance when no one else would." "Neil," Margaret said gently, "I gave you a door. You were the one who opened it and filled this place with love." Jamie darted over them, holding up a flat pebble like it was a trophy. "Look, I got it to skip 4 times. Alexandra only managed once." "That's because your arm is spring-loaded," Alexander called from behind, wiping his hands with a smile. Margaret laughed and beckoned Jamie to sit beside her. "I'm starting to think you've been training in secret, just to embarrass him." Jamie grinned. "Maybe." As afternoon faded to golden light, the scene around the garden softened into something almost storybook-like. The mansion behind them stood tall, proud, but no longer aloof. Its walls no longer guarded wealth, they guarded memory. And now, those memories were good. Emily leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder, something she never imagined would feel so natural, so right. He wrapped his arm around her, his touch no longer cautious but sure. "I never thought I'd be someone worthy of this," she said quietly. "You were always worthy," he replied. "I was just too blind to see it." Nearby, Margaret rested her head back and closed her eyes, listening to the gentle chatter, the distant chirping of birds, and the laughter of a boy whose innocence had been restored. She breathed in deeply. It was a word that had eluded her for many years, not because she didn't have comfort or wealth, but because she had not seen her son truly happy. She had not seen her home alive, and she had not found someone who could carry her legacy of love forward. But now, as the sun dipped lower and the garden glowed in its embrace, Margaret felt something she hadn't dared to hope for. completion. That evening, after dinner was shared not in silence but with candlelight, stories, and joy, Alexander walked Emily back out into the garden. The moon had risen, casting soft silver across the world. "Something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket again. He pulled out a folded letter, worn at the edges. Emily tilted her head. "What's this?" "Mother gave it to me the day you arrived. Said I should read it only when I truly understood what it meant to love without pride." He handed it to her. Emily opened the letter carefully, unfolding the soft paper. "Alexander," it began, in Margaret's elegant script, "if you are reading this, it means the woman standing beside you has already changed everything." It spoke of humility, of second chances, of the rare and priceless beauty of someone who chooses kindness over convenience. Margaret had seen something in Emily before anyone else did. She had trusted in her heart even when her son resisted. And most of all, she had wanted Alexander to learn that love, true love, does not come in the form of social standing or wealth, but in character, in compassion, and in courage. By the time Emily reached the end of the letter, tears slid silently down her cheeks. "I thought I was just passing through your world," she whispered. "But your mother, she planned this from the start." "No," Alexander said softly, turning her toward him. "She just recognized something I wasn't brave enough to see. But I see it now, and I'm not letting it go." He kissed her then, under the moonlight, and this time there was no hesitation, no conflict, no fear. Just two hearts, finally home. From her window, Margaret watched the scene unfold. A smile touched her lips. She turned off the lamp beside her, pulled the covers to her chest, and closed her eyes, not in sadness, but in rest. She had done what every mother hopes to do. She had built a family, not with walls, but with love. And now, beneath the stars and blooming jasmine, that family began its next chapter, one rooted not in legacy or lineage, but in the power of second chances, open hearts, and timeless love. The end.